So if you are wanting to follow along, we have a notebook which you can follow along with. Basically, it doesn't require any Python to do this setup, but if you wanted to sort of see the steps, you can follow our documentation, or you can look at this notebook, and it sort of gives you step by step of what you need to get going. So we talk about the architecture. We'll dig into all of this. So just wanted to put that out there. We do have the notebook up if you want to follow along that way. You can go back and forth. This is sort of like reference material. So I will pass it on to Trey, and we will get going. You'll have to share your screen. You should be. Just made you presenter, yeah. So click on the arrow, that one, and then, yeah, whatever you want to share. Yep, you're going.
All right, hey guys. Hey, so today's kind of in a nutshell goal is to get ClarityNLP up and running on your laptop or whatever local machine you're using. So I'm going to start by directing us to the Clarity documentation. So this URL here, claritynlp.readthedocs.io, and we're looking at the Running ClarityNLP Locally page. All right, so like Charity mentioned, hopefully by now you guys on your local machine have Docker installed. If not, there's 2 links here that are great for explaining how to do so. And if you complete those 2 tasks, you'll have Docker and Docker Compose installed on your local machine, which will be everything you need in order to get ClarityNLP installed on your system. A couple kind of notes before you actually kind of kick things off. You want to make sure your host VM that's going to be running these containers has at least 8 gigabytes of memory allocated to it. And if you're not sure how much is allocated, I'm speaking for Mac. I think for Windows, this Docker icon is in the bottom right-hand corner. You can click this, click Preferences, and on here. In this Advanced tab, you can allocate how much memory to your default VM. I'm using a different system to provision my VM, so ignore that too. And disk size we have here is 256 gigabytes. Disk size recommended, and it can be a lot less. Right now, my VM is 50 gigabytes. It's really depending on how much data you think is going to be in your database. So we'll kind of leave that up to your judgment. All right, so step 1, or 2 in this case, let's clone the repo. So I'm going to basically go through this process, and if anyone has problems along the way, feel free to let us know. This is meant to be kind of a resource for everyone from now and onwards to have a successful installation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to follow this.
Can you zoom in a little bit? Make that a little bit bigger. There you go. That looks good.
All right, so we're just going to run this step here, git clone the project. CD into the clone project, and now what it's built to do. Alright, so now the project contains many Git submodules, so independently version controlled segments of code. So in order to populate those segments of projects, we're going to run this command.
And that's just a function of how we manage our repo, basically. So a lot of these are sort of web apps that we don't want to put in the main Clarity repo, so we just use Git submodules to do that.
So now we're going to create an environment file, .env, and we're now going to copy an example.env file and fill its contents into the newly created .env file. And the .env file should remain in your git ignore file so it doesn't make it into your version control. Reason being is there will most likely be sensitive credentials and ports, etc. So it's best not to put that into your repository. But that .env.example is basically some default suggestions, so you don't have to worry about kind of picking what ports a particular service will run on. So that's what that is what that is there for. All right. So now the fun part. Now we kind of get to kick off the build. So there's two things you can do. You can either run this shell script, which is basically going to run some commands on your behalf, or you can access the Docker daemon directly via docker compose up --build, either one, enter. All right, so this is the first time that we're running the project, and it's going to go out to the different, find these images on public Docker registries. Also, there's some custom images that are responsible for some of the services we have. So it's going to take a while to build this. It's going to take it can take, depending on your machine's performance, 20 to 45 minutes. And so the next time let's say you turn down the system, next time you turn it back on, it's going to use local cache on your machine to access the already built images, etc. And so it'll only take around a minute or so. Again, a little bit depending on your system's performance, but it'll be much faster the next time around. So this is going to go through a gauntlet of things. You can kind of let that run in the background, and there's some other. Let's take a look at our notebook for some guidance here. There's some other talking points that we want to discuss while that's running in the background. And feel free to follow along. So hopefully, if you haven't installed the system already, you can kick that off in parallel, and we can kind of continue with the cooking course right now. So post installation via Docker. We kind of touched on that. Hopefully you have a nice terminal to watch all the magic happen. Talk about some of that. So once it's up and running, there's similar type of shell script utilities to manage spinning down these containers. So please look at this notebook here, and also reference running with ClarityNLP. You'll also be able to get similar information to help manage the turning on, the turning off, the updating of your local Clarity installation. And so once this actually gets up and running, you'll be able to, you can actually click these links and it will reference that particular service based on the default port from that .env.example file. So just to kind of help you start to look at the services that are available to you after installation is completed.
And can people use their own Docker or their own Solar instance if they already have one? How would we do that?
Right.
I mean, we have to demonstrate it, but what's the best way to do that if you have a Solar instance already and you want to use that instead of running the embedded one with Clarity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, it boils down to configuring your .env file to essentially point to that possibly remote Solar service. And so if we go down to go up to
Oh, there it is.
It's real fun. So you see here, these are the Solar-specific environment variables, and so you would essentially replace, let's say, if you have a remote solar instance accessible by some IP address, you would replace it here as such, and that will instruct the core NLP API to say, okay, instead of looking to my local NLP solar container, I'm going to look at whatever remote instance that you have set up, and it will behave just the same. So bear in mind, if you're working on this local NLP solar, and the particular version that we use, is working fine for you, and the remote is a different version, be mindful that you might run into schema issues, etc. So just be kind of cognizant of that. And also mind the port. So we create a sample port for you. So when all this gets set up, you'll hopefully see if this finishes up relatively soon. We provide a few documents to kind of get you out of the gate, but if your remote solar instance has a different core name and sample, which most likely it does, you'll have to update that as well.
Yeah.
And Charity, can you describe if you were to use your own solar core, how that configuration of the fields works in this
Yeah, so
environment?
can you scroll back down to the bottom? So we talked about this a little in the notebook. These are the default solar fields. So when we talk about document ingestion, you'll see these again. But these are default solar fields that ClarityNLP uses. Primarily, obviously, it's going to use the report text because that's where the text data is, and that's where we do our analysis on. So if you, say, had your own solar instance and you wanted to use that, you don't have to follow our field names. You can use your own field names, and you just have to change this in your .env file very similarly. Kind of just quickly going through what these are. So ID, report ID, these can be the same. They're just, it's just an identifier essentially. And these are useful for making crosswalks back to your source data. So for example, if you are loading data from a CSV file and you have an identifier and Clarity finds all these features you want to link back, this ID field is how you would link back to your source data. So it's valuable to have. You have the source field, which is basically like, you can put anything in this field. That's basically just where the document comes from. So it can be things like the hospital, or it could be the data set, or if you're loading from, say, PubMed, it could be the journal. It could be lots of different things. You have the report date, which is sort of a standard Java UTC date format, which you'll see later on as well. The subject is generally the patient field, and the report type, which we'll also talk about more later, is the report type mapping. So that's things like chest x-ray, nursing note, things like that. So we don't use all these fields. Some of them are just stored back to results for more information. But if you have your own solar instance, it's certainly helpful to have linkages to these fields so that they could be mapped back to Clarity and its results. And it'll give you the best Clarity experience, I believe. So do you want to talk about like any issues that we've seen? The ones we brought up here were like VPN. Sometimes Docker has issues on VPNs.
Yeah, if you're running Docker locally and you happen to be on a VPN connection, depending on what your VPN client is, in my case it's a couple of Cisco, AnyConnect, I use sometimes, and that particular client does allow you to if you go to preferences for Cisco AnyConnect, there is an option to allow LAN environments access when using VPN. This works, in my own experience, most of the time, but it can be kind of wonky. So just be mindful. If you're I realize, maybe your remote solar, is only accessible, via a VPN connection, or try to minimize, the best you can to, not have to be on VPN if you're working locally. So there is that. And again, I can't speak speak to every VPN client, but most of them have some type of LAN VPN configuration. So if it is available to you, then you look into that and enable it. So that is one roadblock. Let's see, if your data is hosted in an air-gapped environment, you'll need to set up ClarityNLP first, and then move to the VM to the air-gapped environment as a second step.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we're dealing with PHI, that data cannot be hosted on the public, even your public, your network inside your environment. So it has to be behind another firewall or VPN. So Clarity needs basically access to set up all these libraries and do all this stuff. But once it's set up, it should be fine to set it up and then move it to a secure environment. One thing you will know is you will not get updates. And since we're kind of doing rapid development, that may be something you want to think about. Like, do you have a strategy to handle, getting updates and Clarity after it's been moved to a secure environment? Is there a way to move that back and forth? And think about that when you're setting up these type of environments.
Kind of along similar lines, it's not just solar that can be kind of swapped out for a remote compatible service. So with MongoDB, Postgres, we use several databases to give ClarityNLP its functionality. So if you see one that is already remotely hosted somewhere, you don't want to migrate to your local running service. Again, it's very similar to how we swapped out the solar environment parameters. You can do so with those other services as well.
And the only other issue that we've seen is issue with port mappings, and we put a list of the ports that Clarity runs on by default. So just something to keep in mind if you have other local services running and you're running locally, make sure that you don't have any port conflicts, and Docker may have issues running certain containers if you do have port conflicts. So you want to make sure those are open and accessible. And again, you could change the mapping in your .env file if you wanted to change the port. How are we doing on our install?
Right now it's pulling down Dr. Louise for our scheduler.
Okay. Yeah, does anybody have any questions about this part of the setup? Any issues they've had? It does take a while the first time, but after you get it going, it's pretty fast. But yeah, this first setup, there's a lot of install and packaging involved.
Yeah. You'll find the cache very incredible for future runnings of this system. So don't feel like it takes this long after this.
I don't have any questions, but I'm going to jump off this place because it's going to be awesome for the archive. This video going through it like this is, I think, literally going to be highly rewatched video, so I appreciate it. And I apologize I have to jump off to get on the plane. Thank you guys.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah. You can hear the screaming children at the airport. Wherever you are. Yeah, does anybody have any other questions or anything? We'll go on to some of the other setup services, and we'll probably do those from our AWS instance.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess one thing to mention, do you have any recommendations for production systems versus local systems, since you've had a lot of experience setting those up? Or closer to production, I guess. As production as we get here at GTRI.
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways that you can take ClarityNLP and put it in a production environment. So option one, I'll give you two options. Option one, you can, instead of kicking off that build the way we did, you can kick off the build slightly differently. You can do Docker Compose and then reference the prod YAML file. And essentially, the prod YAML file is slightly different than the normal Docker Compose YAML file. And the prod YAML file is different in that it references slightly modified Docker files, where based on the particular service, it might be kicking off Flask in a production way. It might be kicking off the Node app using production environment variables, which cause the app to behave in a manner that would be more befitting in a production environment. So you might not use the local in-memory Redis. You might communicate with a dedicated Redis instance, etc. But we take care of all of that for you. You just have to reference the prod YAML, and the production decisions will be made, and it behaves just the same way that you are watching this system build. It will do the exact same thing. You might have different port decisions to make in your production host, and so again, it pulls from the same .env file, and so you'll be able to take a look and make those decisions. But that's just option one. Option two, which is, in my opinion, a more enterprise, scalable, container orchestration like deployment. And what I mean by that is if you have some type of internal build process, maybe Jenkins, and you have some type of container orchestration infrastructure via Rancher or Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, essentially you can add a Jenkins file or some other continuous delivery build file, depending on what service you're using, and you can essentially hand-pick the particular Docker files for each particular service. So here we're pulling all the prod files for each of these services, if there is one, pushing that to our internal private Docker registry, which then ties into our build pipeline, which will then notify our container orchestration service, which will then pull down the built image from our internal registry, and that is kind of a, this isn't a lesson for that, but just know that ClarityNLP is flexible in that, whatever your kind of deployment strategy that you're going for, we have Docker files, production Docker files for each of these services, and so depending on what your skill level is, you can make it work for a variety of production deployment techniques. So the easiest kind of like way I said, option one is just build referencing that Docker Compose prod YAML, and then I'll leave it as an exercise for folks to pinpoint those Docker files individually and tie it in with some internal build process that you have, and notification steps with your orchestration services, etc. So yeah, that's kind of like we could probably do another half a cooking course maybe on like look at our build process or some folks
if there's interest,
maybe, let us know, and if there's interest, we might be able to do something like that. So now, while this is building, we're going to kind of pick out a few other utility services that we've created that don't really have enough to kind of make it on their own cooking course, but it's kind of a good time to kind of expose some of them, and because they definitely have a good place in the ClarityNLP.
And they're important for setup too. So.
Yeah, that's true. So report type mapping. So maybe I'll let
Yeah, so I can talk about port type mapping a little bit. So port type mapping was sort of one of the earliest features that we did when we built ClarityNLP, and that's because we thought it was really important to just have this standardized ability without using a better term, across different user sites. So one of our goals with Clarity, obviously, is to have a phenotype or NLPQL definition and be able to run that among different sites. Well, we knew that one of the barriers to that was that different sites often have different report type ontologies. So some things, the example we used here was some things say chest x-ray and some things say CXR. But if we're looking at the report type mapper, we probably just want to look for, if we're trying to map to a single thing, we know that those are the same thing. So we want to be able to map to those. So what we did was we created a report type ontology with the help of our clinical folks like John Duke here. It's based on LOINC, but also includes some definitions from RADLEX. And basically what it does is it takes your, very granular definitions for very site-specific definitions for report types and maps them to like a common dictionary. So I think we got people from like 8 different sites, or maybe less, maybe more, to give us their report type mappings. And what we were able to do is map those to a common dictionary ontology using the tool that Trey's going to demonstrate. And like I said, once you do that, you have an NLPQL standard, and NLPQL can be shared from site to site, and that's how we create our reproducible, computable phenotypes. So it's definitely a really important part of our platform that we want to highlight today, and an important part of setup, because we do try to map things if we can for you with a tool. I don't think we're going to talk about that today, but we do have a tool that tries to map them automatically. But then we also have this handy manual tool, this user interface that's really beautifully built that you can sort of map your report types to a tag.
Correct. And so essentially on the left here we have report types.
So how do people load their report types in? Sorry, one.
Oh, yeah.
And is there a default user and password for this tool? Is the other question I was going to ask you.
There's not a default, but essentially, if you try to, essentially you can register, and then we can give you access. We get notified, and then we can say yes or no. There's no default.
I guess I meant if someone's running this locally.
Oh, yes, when they run it locally, they'll have, what it is, I think it's your admin to be like the first admin, and then you can have the ability to change it after that.
Okay, got it.
But yeah, that's right. So I'm going to look at one of our lists and perform mapping on. So on the left we have report types, on the right we have the tags, and so you can select one or multiple report types, and you can select the tag in which you want to apply to it. So I can add this particular tag, and then, or I can remove that particular tag, and again you can select multiple, add that tag, remove that tag, you can click this X to remove that particular tag. So it's a, I think, relatively intuitive way to associate report types with tags. And scroll down here, it's intelligently paginating through, not overwhelming your browser, so you can have a nice, snappy experience and sit back and enjoy your tagging. First cooking joke of the year. So there's also some kind of organizational hierarchy around this report type mapper. So you have the ability to create essentially groups, but call them institutes. So you can create an institute, it'll show up on this list. and then you can view the lists within a particular institute. So these are those lists, and then you can say, okay, I want to perform mapping in that list. Oh, you mentioned Charity, how to actually create report types.
Yeah, create a new list.
A new list. So you'll, like this, you name it, and then you can choose a report type file. This kind of gives you a helpful hint. It needs to be a CSV with one column, and that column will contain your report type name, and at the very top, first field needs to be that report type name. You'll click submit, and then it will add those report types associated with that particular list, and then you'll be able to click map on it, and then it'll show all of your report type names here on the left, and then you can perform your tagging. With tags, similarly, you can add tags. So this will be the same list of tags for any number of whatever list of report type names you're trying to associate against. The exact same process. Also, you have some user management. So this kind of goes to what I was saying about access control. So this is yeah, so that's available to you. So when people try to register, if you have a remotely accessible report type mapping one to add users, there's some access control functionality there for you. Let's see what's next. That's report type mapping.
How's our thing doing? Still churning along.
Oh, that's doing great. Don't let the red worry you. For some reason, the node package manager likes to make everything red. So that's not an error.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. So speaking of access control and security, that's definitely one of our next features that Trey's working on. We're going to talk about that some.
Yeah, so on the roadmap is to add API level security to ClarityNLP, and also a unified SSO experience for these clients that you've seen. So you've seen the report type mapper. In a little bit, you're going to see the ingest front end. You've seen the results viewer. Might be forgetting some, but essentially the SSO experience that I'm referring to is you'll be able to, it'll seem like a seamless ClarityNLP front end. They'll all be disparate applications, but you'll be able to log in once and access all of them seamlessly. So that's the SSO part, and then there's also going to be a token-based API level security. So if you have external applications that want to access resources behind ClarityNLP, there will be a system for issuing those tokens and controlling access and throttling request frequency, etc. Very enterprise level system. So ClarityNLP has reached that point of very large ecosystem of applications, and so we require a sophisticated security level layer. So that's in the works. So in a month or so, we'll be rolling out the first version of that, and so there'll probably be more to come on that. But just know that's in the pipeline for people who are concerned about, rightfully so, about securing their data. So
Looking forward to that.
Document ingestion. All right, so the logical next step, once this thing actually finishes, is now you want to add data to ClarityNLP so it can function. So that's where document ingestion comes in. So there's an additional utility that we call them, and that is let's check that out now. So we're going to go to a hosted version of this since our local is still building. Okay, so right now we're looking at the ingest client. Essentially, it is a form that allows you to upload a CSV file and then map the headers of that CSV to solar fields, and when you click submit, those mappings along with that CSV file arrive at our ingest API, and the ingest API will communicate with the Solar API in order to create those documents on your behalf. So this is just to help lower the barrier in order to get your data into Solar. And so there's these 3 tabs at the top, with CSV being highlighted. There's also database and API, which are not implemented at this time, but just to kind of let you know that this will be a flexible ingestion system that will allow you to ingest not only CSV documents, but also connect with databases or connect with JSON, XML APIs to retrieve data in some format and then massage it and get it into Solar. So let's demonstrate the ingest client. So the first step, you're going to click Parse CSV Headers. So this is going to prompt you to select a CSV file from your local file system. And I have a couple hand-picked ones. I'm going to pick a small one, just for demonstration purposes. So I selected it, and it gives you a little bit of metadata about that file. Okay, everything's green and good. So now we're going to perform the mappings from CSV headers to Solar fields. Okay, so a couple things here is there's 2 ways that you can select a Solar field. You can either map the particular CSV header to a particular, so on the left of the Solar field, so I'm going to skip document source for a second. So patient ID could map to any of these 6 headers that exist on that CSV. So patient ID maps to subject. And document source, this is a manual entry, so it would be applied to every record that gets created in Solar. So we would say, demo. And the Solar field document source will be called demo for each record. Optionally, you can toggle this to be the drop down to select the CSV header. So that's what these toggles here do. They switch it from manual to select from the CSV headers. Okay, so we'll put demo again. Also, if I were to click Start Ingest right now, you get all sorts of form validation saying the ones in yellow are warnings, saying, hey, you might want to put something in here, otherwise we're going to try to make a guess on your behalf. But it's not required. The warnings aren't required for ClarityNLP to function on that data. The reds, however, you need to have something put in there because ClarityNLP needs to, in this case, obviously, it needs to have report text in order to perform. So let's keep going through here and we can get a sense of the overall experience. So as we fulfill that warning, that warning notification drops off. Keep on going through. Report text. So notice when I click report text, that start ingest will no longer be kind of locked out. All right, now it's actually submittable. I'm just going to ignore call type because it's a warning. I just want to show you that warnings will not block you from starting ingest. All right, I'm going to click start ingest. So what just happened? It says successfully uploaded CSV file and scheduled ingest job. All right, so like I was saying, those mappings that you just created, as well as that file, will hit our ingest API. A job will be spun up in the background because imagine you have a large mimic 4 gigabyte file, which I have in my local file system, but we do not have time for that today. It needs to be broken off into a job to not to free up this for future ingestions. And it finished. It finished by this table on the left here, ingest records. And so this is one we just finished, November 7th, 4:42. 5 hours off here with our server time, but it completed. And so what that means is it went through that CSV file and it created Solar records for each row in that CSV file. If it didn't already exist in our Solar database, and we do in this case, it's an optional parameter, but we do dedupe by looking at several fields and forming an MD5 hash, and a uniqueness constraint is applied to that MD5 hash in order to remove or to not add, rather, documents if that MD5 hash is already present in a record in Solr. Like I said, that is optional. So if you're interfacing with our Solr API outside of this ingest app context, perhaps I don't know if it's documented, but there's a query string parameter that's basically saying yes dedupe or no dedupe. So just know there's that flexibility. But in this case, this ingest app is dedupe. So that's why this number actually didn't increment, because I've run this same CSV file ingestion multiple times. So that is kind of in a nutshell. Oh, there's a couple other things actually. There's an add custom field. So this, that's what it says. It's another form to create essentially another field mapping. So we have call type. That was actually a custom one. Note that custom ones, this red X shows up because custom fields are eligible to be deleted. These other 6 are kind of they kind of came with the system, so they're core to the fields that the ClarityNLP is interested in. So those are not deletable, but the custom ones. So if we're to create a new custom field,
And these are basically dynamic fields in Solr, so you can use these for things like querying on them, to maybe filter your documents that you want to run jobs on, or they can just show up as metadata in your result set, so that if you want to do some sort of logic operations on them, to say where demo is true or whatever kind of thing you want to do, it's just metadata. You will know in the source, when it gets converted to Clarity, it will have that suffix that Trey showed, so it won't be just demo. It'll be demo underscore ATTR, essentially.
right. And so that's what happens when you create a custom field. Like I said, you can delete custom fields. And so that is available to you, because we recognize everyone has additional fields, possibly that they want to make use of in Solr. So this ingestion tool accommodates that. So there's no questions on the ingest tool.
I think that's all we have in that notebook.
So that's still churning. We're getting towards the end there from experience.
Does anybody have any questions?
Questions that anyone following along, having problems?
Yeah, if you have questions later after this recording is posted, there's a couple ways you can reach out to us. Obviously, you can email me. If you're on the invite, my email address is on the invite. It's charity.hilton@gtri.gotech.edu. You can reach out that way. If you're on our Slack, you can reach out to any of us on Slack. We have a couple channels going, so you can obviously reach out and ask questions there. You can post issues on GitHub if you want to do it that way. Also, I post all these recordings up to YouTube, so if you're watching from YouTube, feel free to make a comment, and I'll follow and get those down and route those to the right person, depending on the question. So there's lots of ways to get in touch with us. I try to follow all of them and sort of route your questions to the right people. So if you ever have any questions about setup or anything else about ClarityNLP, get those to me, however, and I'll make sure your questions get answered. So I think what it's doing now is it's loading in some vocabulary data, which we use for mapping vocab terms. So in the previous demos, you've seen some of the stuff that Richard did with term expansion. We use the OMOP vocab for that. And these are basically the ones that are publicly accessible, that don't require any licensing. So we give those to you for free, but it does take a while to download them all and get them all loaded into Postgres. Obviously, this could be a scenario where if you already had a Postgres instance with OMOP, you could, point Clarity to that. Like we mentioned, though, you would have to manually set up the schemas or the schema and the tables that Clarity needs. There aren't too many that Clarity needs in Postgres. It's mostly just for sort of job configuration and management. But that could be an instance where you do that instead of, running this setup.
Yeah. If you try to do all the hard work for you, if you don't have access to those types of resources, but yeah, we're pulling everything down. We're filling up that database, and then we're going to apply the indexes. And then after that, the NLP API will start, which is the exciting part. We'll probably just hang out and then
Yeah, if we hit it before the end time, we'll wait in anxious desperation. Yeah, it didn't used to be this slow, but since we added the vocab, it kind of slowed it down. But we thought that would be a useful part to include by default into Clarity. So the nice benefit of Docker is it sets all this stuff for you. Obviously, you can have a lot more control if you're sort of technically savvy and know how all these services work and interact. You can do that yourself and sort of tweak those environment files to your own environment. But this is sort of like the whole kit and caboodle type setup. Just get it going. So that's our thought process behind that. And as always, if anybody has any ideas or requests for cooking, if you wanted to discuss specific topics, reach out to me for those as well. I think once we have, I think we got some interesting stuff cooking. Nice fun. But I think once we have, we'll have some interesting things to talk about in the next few months. So looking forward to that.